Sometimes, when people tell you not to set up camp somewhere, you should listen when they say that if you do pitch a tent, you will live to regret it, if you live at all. You can't help but feel a little intimidated, sometimes with good reason. Unfortunately, in my line of work, it's almost inevitable that at some point you're going to end up pitching a tent somewhere that the local people don't want you to. Moving into territories and areas of forest that haven't seen outsiders in quite some time, you just have to get used to the idea that you might not always be entirely welcome, even if you have the permits, the correct permissions and licenses to be there, and the locals have no real right to tell you not to be. It still happens, and sometimes it can get very awkward. Sometimes, it's because the local folks don't like the idea of strangers on their land. They don't know if they can trust you. And to be fair, that's a somewhat natural position. Sometimes, it's because they worry about things like fire damage, noise, or litter. Mostly, if they don't want you there, it's because it's an inconvenience or threat to them. Sometimes though, like the last time, it isn't because they're scared of you. It's because they're scared for you and what might be waiting for you in the forest. Most of the time, those worries don't really bother me. My camping horror story doesn't involve kids packing up a flimsy old tent and building a fire to toast marshmallows over. My camping story involved a full-on professional expedition, a filming trek for a popular nature documentary channel with a huge budget. A budget that was mostly spent on equipment. As you'd expect, this meant that we had some fantastic stuff, both in terms of our photography and lighting apparatus, and also in terms of our actual camping. Our tents were top-notch, we had portable barbecue equipment, and small gas stoves for our food, and the entire camp was not only well scouted, but well protected with perimeter traps, movement sensors, and what are known as bear bangers. Essentially, these are tripwire-style traps that will set off a small, but very loud explosion if a bear does happen to catch on it, scaring the big beast back into the forest and away from the camp. With all that stuff, I usually tended to feel quite safe. We were actually in the area to shoot footage of moose, another large animal which, though not a meat-eater, could be dangerous if you happened to get too close. This time, however, it wasn't the bears or the moose the locals were warning us about, but something far worse. The thing the locals told us of went under a number of different names. It seemed that each surrounding village that we passed on our way to camp had a different name for it in the local dialects. Translated, the names came out as Hollow One, Empty Spirit, and perhaps creepiest of all, Swallower. During the daylight hours, we ignored these stories and the people's pleas for us not to go. But as the sun began to set and the darkness to close in, our minds naturally began to form shapes to fit those awful names. Dark, indistinct shapes of enormous things, crashing through the brush with both antlers and teeth. The last night I ever camped, one of my colleagues told me of the local myth of the Wendigo, a sort of half-spirit creature. He said that it stalked through the trees, its half-rotted skin falling in huge folds from its frame, skeletally thin, because no matter how much it ate, it could never satisfy its hunger. It was, he said, a well-known local legend, but in reality nothing more than a spook story. I believed him, until I woke hours later to the sound of the same man screaming. He was outside the tent, pointing in a fit of absolute terror into the wall of black beyond the camp, to a place where the faint outlines of trees could just about be seen. He was hollering at the top of his voice, loud enough that the others all came from their tents and stood, almost in a line, silent, except for this raving man, staring into the dark and trying to understand what he thought he had seen. Just as we had begun to agree that the guy was probably dreaming, drunk or both, one of the bear bangers went off to our right. The sound was deafening and reverberated through the forest like a gunshot. At that moment, the birds were disturbed. Hundreds that had been roosting in the treetops suddenly panicked and flew away at once. The resulting swirl of flapping and feathers, mixed with the ruffled disturbance of the leaves, made me think afterwards that perhaps I was mistaken in what I thought I saw. That perhaps it was this movement and some illusion created by it that made me think that I saw an enormous head, many times the size of a normal moose, with antlers more like those of a deer, jutting out from amongst the treetops. Maybe it was the birds that made me think I'd seen a creature at least 20 feet tall, lumbering slowly through the woods in search of food that would never fill its belly. This was the explanation I gave myself, until I saw the shots. The following morning, we eagerly examined the images from the various hidden trail cams that we'd set up on the paths leading up to the camp. On most, there was nothing of note. A few birds, a fox, and on one, an adolescent wolverine. On one image, however, taken late the previous night, there was an image that made each of us swear never to camp in that or any forest again. It was not an animal. It was part of one, a hind leg, as thick around as the trees behind it. The foot was three-toed, crookedly arched and leathery, like the foot of some gigantic bird, and sported at the end of each toe a talon of murderous length. In the top left of the image was what appeared to be a dead bear. It was not in a heap on the ground, but upright, dangling. It was being dragged, heavily, by the scruff of its neck, away into the forest by what looked from the blurred image on screen to be an enormous human hand, gripping tightly to its fur. Something of titanic proportions had killed the bear and was taking it away to feed upon. We packed up that morning and cancelled the expedition, each of us sick with fear. As we made our ways back down the hillside and through the villages, the locals simply shook their heads, happy to see that we were still alive, but happier still that we were leaving. On our way through, one old woman kept repeating the same words over and over at us in a local dialect. I found out later that the word translated as lucky. We submitted that photo to the archives of the channel, expecting it to be all over the news by the following day. Instead, it simply disappeared into a wall of silence. Whether it is still sitting in a vault somewhere, or whether the channel was told by some other agency not to pursue the matter, I don't know, but the image had never been seen since, which may be a good thing. Sometimes seeing things once is enough. The scariest thing about camping is not the dark of the forest that surrounds you. It's the horrible nagging thought of what that dark conceals, who or what is waiting within it, and what they might do when they get closer. Often when I see camping horror stories on YouTube, they follow a similar, well-trodden pattern. A bunch of friends, usually young people, pack up their stuff and head out into the woods to a spot they are familiar with. But on that particular night, experience something wildly out of the ordinary, or encounter some strange creature or paranormal experience. Now I'm sure that somewhere in the past there might have been a nugget of truth to some of these stories, but nowadays they just seem like cookie-cutter versions of the same tale, told with a slightly different twist. This is not one of those stories. The only person on this particular camping trip was me. No marshmallows, no friends going out into the woods for a joke. Just me. Now I know for some people that might sound weird. Why the hell would you go out camping on your own? The honest answer is because I used to like it. For me, alone time in the forest, with no one around but the trees, the animals and the fresh air was relaxing and rejuvenating. It was something I started doing in my late teens, at first just going to the woods close to my house. Later, I would take entire weekends, hiking out to some beautiful spot and then setting up camp there, all on my lonesome. Around once a month I would escape the smog and the heat of the city, drive up into the mountains, and after parking my car up at the start of a trail, would head out into the forest with the intention of staying 1 or 2 days by myself in nature. It was both solitary and idyllic, until it wasn't. That one night last spring, I had just parked the car and stepped out to arrange my gear, when an old flatbed pickup truck, the only other vehicle I had seen for miles, slowly rolled up beside me. Inside were 2 guys who at first just sat there saying nothing and staring. After about a minute of this, I asked if I could help them, whether they were lost and needed directions or something. They looked at each other, then both burst out laughing. Then one, rolling down the window, leant his head out and spat on the ground a few inches from my shoe. "Son," he said with a real twang in his accent, "you're clearly the one who's lost. Now I suggest you get back in your car and git." I stared at them in disbelief. Trying to stay polite, I said that I was there for the weekend and that I was going to camp in the woods. Again, the long, silent stares. "I don't think you heard me," said the first guy again. "I said git." They both then laughed and sped away. For a while I did consider not going into the forest. I thought that perhaps I should get back in my car and just head home, but I decided that to do that would be cowardly. Their intention was clearly to intimidate me, and though they never said it explicitly, I couldn't help thinking that there was a racial element to the way they looked at and spoke to me. I was not going to let a bunch of redneck hicks win, so I carried on with my plan, locked the door, and headed off on my hike into the forest. Everything went fine. The place was beautiful, the isolation refreshing as the mountain air, and by the time I had set up my camp, eaten my evening meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag, I had pretty much forgotten my strange encounter, until I heard the noises. Camping by yourself, you get very accustomed to hearing the sounds around you, not to mention good at recognizing what is a normal bit of forest noise, and what is movement of larger animals. Crawling out of my sleeping bag, I quietly unzipped my tent, stuck head out into the night air, and listened to see if the sounds, the breaking of twigs, and what sounded to me like the soft rustle of whispers, would come again. At first, there was silence, then the sound, the definite indication that something or someone was there. A little panicked, I took my phone from my pocket and decided to do some investigation. I couldn't see any smoke rising anywhere close, but it was possible that other people might have had the same idea and decided to set up camp close by. One of the apps on my phone was a Bluetooth detection app. It allows you to see other similar devices in the area and makes it easy if there are a few of you to locate each other if you get separated. Obviously on my own, I barely used it, but it was on my phone, so I decided to use it, to look and see if there was another camp nearby. If there was another camp and people at that camp had phones, then I'd see their devices on screen, and then I'd know there was no need to panic. When I saw what the app fed back though, panic was the only logical response. There were phones in the area, 9 of them. They showed up on the map on my phone like little glowing red dots. Rather than being clustered in one camp, however, they were separated. 9 separate phones, 9 individuals, in a tight circle around me. My own phone showing up in blue in the center flashed as each of the other phones got closer, moving in slowly in a coordinated shrinking formation, the circle closing around me. I decided to run. I left my tent, my equipment, everything, and bolted, sprinting in the dark through the forest and back in the direction I came. Several times I stumbled. I twisted my ankle, badly bruised my knees and elbows, but at least I put distance between me and the circle of strangers creeping closer and closer to camp. After around 2 hours, moving as quickly as I could down the mountain and through the woods, I emerged onto the road around a mile from where I had parked my car. Walking back, slowly toward it, I heard the sound of another engine and decided to duck back into the woods so as not to be seen. On the road, the same flatbed truck that had stopped to speak to me earlier slowly rolled past. The same 2 men were in the front, but now there were 7 more, seated in the flat back like a group of builders or gardeners heading to a job. They were all wearing camouflage, and every one of them was holding a shotgun. Eventually, they rolled past and disappeared down the road. Around a mile later, I found my car and drove away as fast as I could. It is possible that this group were out on an expedition of their own, that they had come out that night to hunt small animals or some of the larger mammals, and that their presence in the forest that night was completely unrelated to my being there. Perhaps the way they were in formation in a perfect circle around me, creeping ever closer, in their camo gear through the dark of the forest, was just a coincidence, but maybe not. Somehow, I couldn't shake the feeling that had I not run when I did, those men would have been hunting me.